Overlord. Volume 14, Chapter 4, Well-Prepared Traps, Part 2a. And now, Ins was the only one remaining at the encampment. If all went according to plan, the main event should be starting soon. Ins cast the spell, Body of Effulgent Beryl. Those who wished to destroy Ins, even if they knew little of the weaknesses of skeletal-type monsters, would know to use blunt weapons. If Ins was to lose a significant chunk of HP due to his weaknesses before he achieved his goal, that would be somewhat troubling. And then, the delay teleportation Ins had cast before, took effect. In other words, things were indeed proceeding as he had predicted. It seemed like Albedo was not their target after all. Ins was relieved. If she was their target instead, things would have gotten quite difficult. But was that really the case? Could this be a double-layered trap? The enemy was teleporting behind Ins. A single enemy. Someone who preferred close-quarters combat. While his opponent was being delayed, Ins cast an Explode Mind spell on the teleportation destination. Afterwards, he stood still, waiting for his opponent to arrive. At first, he had planned to use Life Essence to confirm if they had lost health, but ultimately decided against that. He heard the sound of the explosion the moment his opponent arrived. Ins immediately began moving forwards, away from his enemy, and turned around. Silver, no wait, the luster is different. Is that platinum? Or a metal I do not know of? The explosion kicked up quite a bit of dust, and at its center, stood a set of platinum-colored full-body armor. 4 weapons hovered around them, following their every move. A spear, a katana, a hammer, and a great sword. All of them were oversized for humans, their appearance screamed form over function. Nazarik's treasury held many more weapons similar to these. The weapons had a similar luster as the armor. It was then highly likely that they were not silver, but platinum instead. Given that was the case, however, it created more questions than it answered. Ignoring the monetary value of the precious metal, platinum had no special magical properties at all. He could not fathom what advantages could be granted by creating weapons and armor out of it. The most likely explanation was that it was only platinum-coated, to hide the true metal the equipment were made out of. An example he could think of was the golem he had just learned was in Kyuhyukao's room. There were other examples of the same technique being used in Nazarik as well. The next most likely explanation was that it was a metal that was identical to platinum in appearance, but Ins was not well versed in the types of metal in this world. Ins's undivided attention was on his opponent's every move. After all, even trivial intel could tip the balance of a fight. What was unsettling to him was the fact that his opponent, since their debut, had not shown any emotional response at all. Since their appearance, they had stood still in one spot with a daunting pose. Was it because they had not taken any damage, they had not bled at all, that they had resorted to such showmanship? It was impossible for them to have not taken any damage at all. It was hard for Ins to believe that it had taken the full brunt of his Explode Mind, but all it did was sully that eye-catching armor with dust. Even with Ins's necromancy job classes, it was still impossible for him to gain complete immunity to the damage of a high-tier spell. It was impossible without underhanded tricks, especially because Explode Mind's damage type was non-elemental. It could not have been nullified so simply. In that case, did their carefree attitude stem from them toughing it out, or was it from their do-or-die resolve? Or perhaps they really had an ability to nullify the damage. Did you think that I would just stand here without taking any precautions? There are more around you. He tried to gauge his opponent's reaction through conversation, or at least that was what he had intended anyways. His opponent, however, did not give him much chance to speak, as the armored fellow unabashedly took an offensive stance. The hammer in their arsenal floated to where they could easily grab it. That revealed a piece of intel to Ins, causing him to gently laugh deep down in his heart. This meant that their target was not Albedo, but Ins himself. Since they had not bothered to converse with Ins at all, they were not trying to buy time. They were probably planning to end this fight before any backup could arrive. If they had appeared from the sky and began talking to him, that would have meant that their target was Albedo or that they were both their targets. Everything up till this point had occurred well within the margins of In's plan. However, not even Ins could predict his opponent's next move. Since their weapons moved with them, he had thought that they were the fighter type and would want to close the distance between them. Instead, his opponent moved his hand in a somatic gesture, causing the giant hammer to suddenly shoot forward. So fast. It was like a high-level warrior had lobbed it at him. Ins could not dodge it at all. If this weapon was not enchanted, it would be nullified by his immunity to non-enchanted projectiles, but no matter which way Ins sliced it, it had to be enchanted. If that was the case, Ins stood still, mimicking the stance his opponent had adopted as he took the hit. Of course, the spell activated the moment the hammer connected with Ins's body. The bludgeoning damage was completely nullified by the body of Effulgent Barrel spell. His gaze had remained on his opponent this entire time, observing his every move. In that moment, his opponent stopped moving, probably out of shock that he had taken 0 damage. The hammer returned to its original position as fast as it had been launched, floating around the enemy. Muahahaha. Ins laughed loudly with his arms extended outwards to show that he was unscathed. Do you understand now? As I am sure you are aware, skeletons are weak to bludgeoning attacks. That is true for me too. So did you really believe that I would not take precautions against it? That I would be so stupid? That's right. Ins patted his own body. I am immune to bludgeoning damage. While he was sneering, his opponent did not seize the opportunity to attack. What does that mean? Ins contemplated. If he made a mistake here, he might not be able to salvage the situation. The enemy landed, raised a hand, and spoke. Their voice was that of a male's. Wall of the world. TL's note, the spell is, the literal translation is World Absolute Barrier, and I would have localized it as World Isolating Barrier, but I have been informed that all wild magic spells are references to some obscure novel. With his foe as the origin, a space-warping shockwave passed by Ins. If it continued to expand in its initial form, this place would be encompassed in a dome. Its size was immense, at least a kilometer wide. Albedo and the other guardians should all be outside of its range. Ins's mind spooled up as he deliberated. This was one of the oldest tricks in the book, to cut off an enemy's connection to the outside world. Then, how hard would it be to break in? Would it be able to prevent someone from running in? Would teleportation still work? Its effect and area of effect also had to be considered. Since it was a dome, could someone enter it through the ground? And most important of all, could he destroy it through any means? He was severely lacking in intel and thus could not be certain of anything, but he could at the very least make some rudimentary inferences. First of all, his opponent knew that Ins was a magic caster for sure, so this should at the very least be able to block teleportation spells. Unless he had a reason to not use the world-class item that could dominate minds, this person wasn't the one who brainwashed Ch4. What if there was a specific reason why he did not use it? Questions continued to pile on, but one thing he was certain of was that he should not underestimate this enemy. That was because Ins had mastery over a wide range of spells and special abilities. From the experience he had gathered through experimentation, he knew their full capabilities. This placed Ins at the top of Nazarick in terms of battle tactics. However, the ability this enemy had just used, Ins could not recall. An ability that would cover this much ground had to be from a super-tier spell or a world-class item. This meant that his opponent had easy access to and immediate use of skills that could rival the heights of those abilities. He was undoubtedly a strong enemy. Someone who could remove Ins, and the other level 100 floor guardians, from the picture. However, faced with this enemy, Ins did not emote at all. Of course, Ins's face could not emote anyways, but his uncertainty could still be observed through his attitude and tone. In's Oulgown would never do something so unsightly. At the same time, he could not allow the enemy to perceive In's joy and relief. The thought of, "It was wise for me to have been the one to face him" came to mind. In squinted his eyes and continued to observe him. Though this was an unknown ability, he could still pick up on certain aspects of it. First, this was an ability that expended HP and quite a lot of it. Given that, this barrier could not be cosmetic only. If he could not figure out its exact effects, he would be in deep trouble. Ins had seen his opponent's immediate loss of HP when he had activated that ability through his Life Essence spell. Mana Essence picked up nothing in contrast, meaning that his foe was of a pure warrior build with no mana at all. If the mysterious enclosure was an inescapable prison, it would not be odd for his opponent, who had effectively imprisoned Ins in this dome, to relax a little. Ins began to calmly ask a question with that in mind. He used an uncharacteristically gentle tone given he had just been smacked with a hammer. "I will pardon your prior ambush. I do believe that you already know of my name, but do allow me to reintroduce myself. I am the Sorcerer King Ins Oulgown. Now then, it is your turn. Could you tell me your name?" After a few seconds of silence, he received a reply. "Riku Agnaya." Ins immediately began to analyze the information he had just gained. The likelihood that this barrier not only prevented his escape, but also prevented reinforcements from making their way in just increased drastically. The fact that he would risk exposing intel meant that he was trying to tell him, "You can't escape, and also, your reinforcements won't make it in." In the documents compiled by Sabas and Demiurge, there were no mentions of the name Riku. Someone this strong would not have slipped through their information-gathering network. Even if he was Hermit, there were still things that could not be explained. In any case, someone this strong would have surely ended up in the kingdom's history books. For there to be no records of him at all was absurd. The most likely explanation was that he had been given an alias. But why would he give him an alias? If he was from the kingdom, he should have proudly declared his name and his intention to destroy the root of all evil that had started this war. Was it because he was someone who wished to remain anonymous of his own volition? Another possibility was that he was trying to draw In's aggression towards the real Riku Agnaya, or perhaps the knowledge of his true name gave In's power over him or something. Although it was essentially pure wilderness when those lands came under his rule, they had still gathered quite a bit of intel from the demi-human residents of that land. Of the intel they gained, one was about the connection some had between their true name and soul, and how one could become more susceptible to curses should their true name become known. However, after much investigation by Nazarick, they could not find conclusive proof of such a phenomenon. They had relegated this intel as plain folk legend. So was it possible that Riku was of a tribe that held similar beliefs? He had little to no intel. This was not the most ideal situation for him to make deductions here and there. As far as he could remember, there were only two powerful beings with connections to platinum. One of which was not a humanoid, the other was. I have heard through the bard's songs, the heroic tale of the 13 heroes. Quite a few of their names have been lost, though I do recall one of them wearing an armor forged in platinum. If I remember correctly, his name was Riku Agnaya. Will those bards not be elated to find out that their tales were true? Would they? I did not know that I was renowned enough for bards to sing of my name. His foe did not shrug, nor did he make any movements as he answered calmly. Was he truly one of the 13 heroes, or was he an impostor? There might be details that he was missing. Good grief, Ins thought. What was true and what was false, it was hard for him to tell. But, given how his opponent was confident enough in himself to face off against the Ins Oulgown who could handily defeat an army of 200,000 with a single spell, the full extent of his capabilities must be explored in this battle. Riku, do you mind me addressing you by this name? Denied. An immediate answer, one filled with palatable disgust in tone. That was rude of me. Perhaps that was too familiar of an address. Shall I refer to you as Agnaya then? Would you still mind? That is fine. Oh. Well then, I have a proposal for you. Become my subordinate, how about it? The air around Riku froze a bit. He did not take a stance, nor did he move at all. Riku just stood there completely unfazed. Ins could not figure him out. If Riku viewed him as an inferior, it would make sense why he did not take a stance at all. After all, Cocytus was the same during his battle with the lizardman. So, was Riku looking down on him or not? He felt different compared to Cocytus back then. So, perhaps that already was the stance he intended to take for this battle. He might have planned to stand in one place and have his floating weapons do all of the work for him, which was why he had adopted such a battle stance. Looks like I've been rejected. How regretful. Could I implore you once more? I am currently trying to recruit powerful individuals into my services. Even that Momon of Darkness has been happily under my employ. If you are willing to become my subordinate, I would even end my conquest of the kingdom right here. You alone are worth more than this country. Denied. If words could kill. There wasn't a single shred of hesitation in his voice. Ins, without showing any emotions, began to ponder the hidden meanings behind their little back and forth just now. Even if he had the confidence that he could defeat Ins and save the kingdom, did he truly have no doubts or hesitations? Even if Ins was killed, was he truly certain in his belief that the Source Rouse Kingdom's army would just give up? Perhaps he does not care about the kingdom after all. Is he from another nation? Cloak of Light. Riku's armor began glowing. For a brief moment, Ins thought that it was the sun reflecting off of his armor until he noticed that Riku's HP had just decreased. That was undoubtedly the activation of some sort of ability. Now he had concrete proof. Riku's abilities were powered by his own health pool. However, because lost HP could just be recovered through restoration spells or potions, abilities that were powered by HP were usually weaker by comparison. All in all, the higher the ability's HP cost, the stronger it would be. The same logic should apply even in this world. Riku had activated his special ability, that meant their parley had broken down. Ins immediately cast his spell. Greater Teleportation. Ins teleported all the way to the edge of the translucent dome. After his sight had adjusted, he found the translucent barrier blocking his way. Teleportation failed. He took a look around. It appeared as though Riku did not have the ability to follow him through his teleport. He was nowhere to be found. In front of Ins, not too far away, was his intended destination, the great underground tomb of Nazarick. He could at least confirm one thing of this barrier: it cut off teleportation completely. That said, since he was now in front of the barrier, that meant that teleportation to destinations within it was still possible. Only teleportation in and out of the dome was disabled. It seemed like if one were to try and teleport outside, they would instead be teleported to the edge of the dome closest to their intended destination. This was crucial intel. He had originally intended to not use teleportation throughout this battle, but it was still worth it to have gained this intel at the cost of one of his trump cards. Ins then extended his hand to touch the barrier. If it had defensive capabilities, he would probably receive the damage immediately, but that was unlikely. He thought so because the interrupted teleportation did not do damage to him either. The bones in his finger made contact with the barrier. Contrary to its soft appearance, it was extremely hard. When he tried to exert force on it, never mind breaking, it did not phase at all. It was like a wall that separated worlds apart. Ins pulled out a common gold coin and tossed it. The coin hit the barrier and bounced off. Next, he cast a lightning spell at a pre-calculated angle. It cannot get through. Just as he became satisfied with the results of his experiments, the delay teleportation spell activated once again. No doubt it was Riku. Ins cast Body of Effulgent Barrel and stood there, with his back towards Riku. After Rika showed up, he used some unknown object to slam into In's body at high speeds. Because it was bludgeoning damage, it was completely nullified by body of effulgent barrel. But for whatever reason, his body was sent flying and pressed against the barrier. That was highly unusual. Normally when an attack's damage had been nullified, its secondary effects would not apply. However, Riku's attack did not follow this rule. So what did that mean? He had no idea as of yet. In slowly, and regally, turned around. The hammer returned to Riku's side. The 4 weapons that surrounded Riku were different from before, they were all glowing white. Combined with the armor, they looked undeniably badass. On the other hand, Riku's health had decreased even further. He had lost more health than when he activated that ability on his armor just then. Was it because he had to apply that ability to each weapon separately, or because teleportation had cost him a bit of HP too? Ins desired more intel. I am immune to bludgeoning damage, I believe I have said that already, so how did you do that? Even if you can teleport, you cannot use it to escape this barrier. Your fate is to perish here. Answer the question, dumbass, Ins thought but did not say it out loud. After all, if he wanted his opponent to talk, he had to avoid pissing him off too much. I see. I am impressed that you could create such an inescapable barrier. I assume then that you have made your resolve already? No response. One of the 4 weapons, the great sword, stopped moving. He's coming. Riku did not appear to wish to converse with him. Ins made the first move with that in mind. Twin magic, obsidian sword. Ins summoned 2 obsidian swords and rushed at Riku. If his opponent was using floating weaponry, he would do the same. One of the swords was deflected by Riku's greatsword and the other's strike was dodged in an unnatural manner. What? Ins couldn't help but vocalize his thoughts. What was shocking wasn't the fact that Riku could dodge the attack, but rather how he had dodged it. Not even Cocytus would be able to pull off what Riku just did. Riku had performed a sideways somersault at head's height to dodge the attack. Although there were other oddities apart from what he had just done, Ins should not be focusing on those details right now. The questions laid in the fact that those movements were inhuman. Normally when a humanoid jumped, they would bend their knees and apply force on them. There should be reflexive movements before the actual jump. However, Riku skipped all of that, applied no force at all, yet still performed a sideways somersault in the same stance he had this entire time. While it was not impossible, especially with spells like fly, not even Ins could pull it off. One's body would always reflexively move in a certain manner when performing such actions. Perhaps those who were adept at using fly would be able to do those moves, but Ins still felt weirded out by those movements. The explanation for it was just on the tip of his tongue, but his brain could not express it properly. While Ins was getting increasingly annoyed, Riku counterattacked with his great sword. Ins's 2 swords were deflected by the other weapons floating around Riku. The great sword, as if it had a mind of its own, flew towards Ins, prompting him to think of his guild weapon. Ins cast defensive magic in response. Wall of skeleton. The great sword clashed with the newly created wall. The wall of skeleton was destroyed in a single hit. Impressive. In place of where the wall of skeleton stood, the honed edge of the great sword pointed towards Ins as it hovered. He had thought that it would return to Riku's side after that, but instead it flew towards Ins as if someone was wielding it. On the contrary, Riku was standing still in his original position, in his original pose. From his observation of that pose, what had been at the tip of Ins's tongue finally came out. Indeed, he was just like a puppet. Riku was moving around like a puppet whose strings were still intact. It was as though giant hands were behind him, one controlling the body and the other controlling the weapons. This isn't something like psychokinesis controlling the weapons, but the armor too? Unless, the insides are empty? Or was a living person within it too? Faced with the great sword's cleave from top to bottom, Ins pulled out a blasting staff to intercept it. The amount of pressure exerted on him made him feel as though he was sinking into the ground. If he had weapon destruction skills, it would be worth his time to target this great sword specifically, but Ins had not bothered to learn such skills. Even anti-material acid spells would take quite a bit of time to chew through this sword, so he was better off attacking Riku instead. Grasp Heart. That was Ins's favorite necromancy spell, yet it had no effect on Riku at all. Did he have immunity against necromancy? Or was it resistance against negative status effects? While Ins was still considering those things, the great sword was swung at him at even greater speeds. Gah! He could neither tank nor dodge it in time, so his body took the full brunt of that attack. After receiving the blow, Ins backed off a little only to bump against the barrier behind him. This position was disadvantageous for him. Greater teleportation. Ins teleported upwards. Because they were summoned through non-conventional summoning magic, the two swords soon returned to Ins's sides. As he was right above his opponent, he would have been easy to spot. Ins did not teleport a long distance away, nor did he intend to buy time until Albedo arrived. This battle was what he had been craving. Just as a precaution, he cast Body of Effulgent Barrel again while observing Riku, who appeared to be a dot from his perspective. He began to ascend as soon as he spotted Ins. He did not try to attack Ins with his weapons, that was probably due to a range restriction. Ins responded by descending. The moment they passed by each other, he threw out the twin obsidian swords. The obsidian sword constructs could only be used as an offensive tool and could not be used to defend oneself. That was because the obsidian sword suffered from a mass loss of durability if used to receive an opponent's attack. If used defensively, the sword's durability would rapidly diminish until they shatter. Riku used the weapons around him to deflect the two swords that were soaring through the skies. Did he put his all into defense? Riku did not choose to counterattack. After brushing past Riku, Ins landed on the ground only to find the spear falling towards him at ludicrous speed. Ins leapt forward, barely dodging the attack. Because he had fly activated already, he did not have any issues getting back on his feet. Ins stood up to distance himself away from that spot as Riku casually descended to the ground. His three weapons floated around him and the spear that had been implanted into the ground soon joined their ranks again. Ins also had his two obsidian swords float by his side. His movements made it all the less believable to Ins that a living being was in that armor. His knees did not bend at all when he landed. It was at this time when Riku, who had been standing with the same pose this entire time, suddenly took the great sword into his own hands. This distance between them was closed in an instant. This was the fastest speed he had moved at yet. He was like a shooting star. Ins sent out the two obsidian swords to intercept Riku's attack, but they were deflected by Riku's katana, subsequently falling onto the ground. Call Greater Thunder. Multiple streaks of lightning converged on Riku, yet he did not slow down at all. It was not as though he hadn't taken damage, Ins could see his HP pool falling. It was more likely that he had suppressed all forms of pain. The great sword was raised high above Ins's head as it was cleaved downwards. Oof! The moment Ins took damage, he saw from the corner of his eye, Riku's katana swinging in from the side. Ins began waving his blasting staff. Riku tanked that attack with his own body. A magic caster's physical strikes weren't so impressive, so if he chose to tank that hit, he must be planning to strike Ins too. His deduction was correct. If Ins were in his shoes, he would have done the same. However, that was a terrible, terrible mistake under these circumstances. Ins smiled deep down as the shockwave began propagating outwards. Riku was knocked far away. Blasting Staff had a similar enhanced knockback enchantment as Yamaiko's female sensei's Iron Fist of Wrath. The cost of that enchantment was the staff's complete lack of offensive capabilities, but it granted distance between a magic caster and their foe, one of the most important things to a caster. Was it because he had been knocked back? The katana's strike only grazed Ins by a little, barely touching his sternum. Riku remained unyielding in pose even after he was knocked back. Ins cast another spell. Summon 10th tier undead. The one to replace the twin obsidian swords was the level 70, melee warrior Doom Lord. A rusted crown sat on his dome and a blood-stained cape hung off his back. Adorning his full plate armor were multiple scythe-like curved blades. Minute amounts of negative energy ebbed from the gaps in its armor in the form of a black mist. His health was constantly decreasing, a penalty placed upon the Doom Lord for its agility which was unthinkably high for a level 70. Optimal use of such a summon required mastery over unit placement. However, Ins just wanted him to be his shield, so none of that mattered to him. Summons were either used as shields or swords. Magic casters who could use them were all pretty strong in general. That said, a powerful pure warrior build could easily ignore these summons. For example, what would Cocytus do? He would probably kite the summons towards the summoner to bring the both of them into his range. What would Albedo do? She would probably use her defensive capabilities to her advantage to charge straight for the caster, completely ignoring the summons. She could also redirect aggro so that they would kill each other. So, what would Riku do? Riku's tactic up till this point had been to rely on his auto-attacking weapons. Though he had wielded his great sword, he had not used any special abilities or martial arts to go along with it. For that reason, Ins did not have a firm grasp on his abilities as a warrior at all. That was why Riku closed the distance between them and beelined for Ins without hesitation at all. An adamant action. He was probably the type to have specialized in super close quarters combat rather than purely relying on his floating weapons. For that reason, if he was able to swiftly destroy his summon, Ins would have lost an option to widen the distance between them. Faced with the rapidly approaching Riku, the Doom Lord tightened his grip on his weapon, a long curved blade set upon a pole, a war scythe. The scythe was shrouded in negative energy, shrouded in the same black mist as before. Ins used the magical link he had with the Doom Lord to give it his orders. It is highly probable that our opponent is not a living creature, but try to confirm it anyways. His order was vague. Needless to say, a summon possessed a portion of its summoner's knowledge, so it should have understood his intentions even without his order, but it was better to veer on the safer side of things. The Doom Lord activated its special ability. Ruinous Night. The rate at which the black smog spewed out of it increased, spreading to its surroundings. Its HP was falling faster than ever, the cost for a short-term boost to every one of its combat-related stats. Not only that, an opponent's passive ability to reduce the amount of damage the Doom Lord dealt to it due to level difference would be completely nullified. Undead that stood in the black smog including the Doom Lord itself would take less damage from light and holy elemental attacks. The same applied for bonus damage due to the difference in karma. Another strength of this ability was the fact that it could be triggered simultaneously on top of other buffs. Ins wanted to receive that buff too, but the black smog only reached so far. To make sure that he would not be targeted by Riku, Ins pulled away from the two combatants. He had made preparations to be a spectator. It was time for him to understand the true extent of Riku's power. The Doom Lord's scythe clashed with the floating great sword, an ear-piercing noise echoed around. Neither backed off a single step, nor were they knocked back. They must have had similar levels of strength for that to happen. After that, the scythe continued to clash against the katana at high speeds, their metallic rings droned on. The great sword's hack was rendered inert by the scythe and the scythe's pierce was blocked by the shield-like hammer. The darting spear was deflected by the scythe's handle as the Doom Lord gracefully dodged the great sword's cleave. Soon enough to take advantage of the distance created by the dodge, Riku leapt forward. Both were on equal footing in terms of offensive and defensive capabilities, but Riku had more tricks up his sleeve. Negative burst. Black rays of light began pulsing from Ins as it swallowed up its surroundings. The Doom Lord healed upon receiving the negative energy, but it wasn't the most mono-efficient way to heal. On the other hand, Riku did not take damage from the spell at all. For him to have taken 0 damage, was it because he had immunity to negative energy? Was it a racial trait? Or was it a job trait? Or perhaps, the most likely explanation, was that it had something to do with his equipment. To have planned to fight against the undead Ins meant that by common sense, he must have prepared against negative energy attacks, a staple of the undead. Even Ins would equip items that bestowed fire resistance if he were to fight against a fire-breathing dragon. While the sounds of their weapons colliding with each other rang out non-stop, Ins cast his next spell. Perfect Unknowable. Ins, now an unknown, came out of the shadow of his tank, the Doom Lord, to circle around them. Suddenly, the katana flew towards him at a speed he could not dodge. It pierced through his robe at the abdomen region. He did not take any damage due to his immunity to piercing damage, but Ins still scuttled behind the Doom Lord's figure. The katana, suspended midair, then began to slash towards the Doom Lord instead. He could see through unknowability. This was not surprising. One would not need to reach Ins's level to gain a couple of countermeasures against that strategy. The problem laid in what method he had used to detect him. Ins had no answers. There were just too many countermeasures, too many for him to narrow it down with the intel he had. So, what should his next move be? Riku seemed to want to target Ins directly given how the levitating weapons were all pointed at him, but with the Doom Lord's presence, they could not reach him at all. After rough calculations of his available options given the current status of the battle, he arrived at the conclusion that he should be spamming offensive spells. If the Doom Lord fell, he could just summon another. The likelihood of this strategy to win was quite high. However, this was not the way Ins wanted to end this. Riku was a powerful foe, something of a rarity in this world, and with myriad abilities foreign to Ins. Given that was the case, it was better for him to witness the full extent of Riku's power over the course of this battle so that he would be better prepared should a similar foe show up in the future. Ins cancelled the cast of an attack spell. While he knew that his priority right now should be on his own defense, he had a specific reason to not do so. It was dangerous, sure, but he had to resist the urge. Ins observed the two's attacks and defenses. The Doom Lord was being suppressed ever so slightly, but neither were taking significant damage. One could call the blows that they were exchanging a back and forth, but the simplicity in Riku's fighting style was quite worrying. Ins knew exactly why the Doom Lord could not gain the upper hand. None of its skills, negative energy attacks, or spiritual attacks had any effects against Riku. At this point, it was all but confirmed that Riku was of a race that had similar properties as golems or other constructs. Perhaps it was some item ability or skill that gave him said properties, or perhaps he was just a plain construct. In terms of which option was most likely, it had to be the first one given that Riku was able to talk. Half-golems or similar races had the same resistances as other constructs, so he might be of one of those races. Although, why would someone of those races be helping out the kingdom? What mattered the most in the moment were Riku's abilities and not his motivations. Why was he using such simple attacks? He appeared to have neither used skills nor martial arts the entire time. One of the supreme beings was a golem user. Riku's movements were nearly identical to the golems controlled by that person. Riku would be easy to deal with if he was a half-golem, but if he was a pure golem with speakers attached or made through secret techniques, things would be much more difficult. As far as Ins knew, a golem's strength scaled with the value of metal used to construct them, the creator's abilities, and the data crystals added. High-tier golems were relatively costly to manufacture. If Riku was a golem, one constructed out of a metal as cheap as platinum yet was this strong, there might be more than a few or even dozens of him laying around. He had to collect more intel. Ins gave the Doom Lord an order. The Doom Lord began releasing more black smog upon receiving his command. Its speed and offensive capabilities were raised even further, to the point where Riku's armor began to take damage. However, The rapid loss of HP on the Doom Lord's part caused it to disappear not long after. Ins had timed for this, as he cast another 10th tier summon undead. It was a level 68 undead, an elemental skull. Its appearance was of a floating skull, surrounding it was a magical haze of light that constantly switched between 4 colors, red, blue, green, and yellow. Ins made it fall back and took its place at the front. The elemental skull was a caster-type undead capable of using magic of the 4 major elements. Its HP was about equal to a magic caster of its level, way below that of the Doom Lord. Its offensive capabilities were pretty impressive, that was because every single spell it cast had the Maximize Magic metamagic tagged onto it. In terms of defense, it had immunity to most spell attacks, including fire, lightning, acid, ice, and other types of elemental attacks. In contrast, it was extremely vulnerable against physical attacks, especially bludgeoning damage. That was why Ins had to stand in front of it. Riku did not raise his guard any further even though a magic caster was now at the front line. He just kept silent, closed the distance between him and Ins, and began attacking. "Why are you not the least bit worried about this?" Ins grumbled in his heart as he used the experience he had gained through his training with Albedo to block Riku's slashes. That said, he could only block 1 slash out of 5, it was basically a one-sided pummel. As Ins' staff was ignored, the great sword, spear, and katana began their attacks. Though the hammer was used once too, it was nullified by body of effulgent barrel. After 3 nullifications, Riku appeared to have finally taken the hint. He never used the hammer afterwards. While Ins had already known about this, Riku was indeed insanely fast. Although he wasn't as fast as the Floor Guardians, he was still relatively fast. Ins was quite fortunate that Riku had stopped using the hammer. If it was still in use, Ins would not be able to win at all. Having bore witness to the Doom Lord's battle, Ins knew he could not serve as an adequate vanguard. Of course, Ins had the option of using Perfect Warrior, but the lack of equipment on his person would guarantee him a loss if he did so. Still, Ins' struggles at being a vanguard began to see some returns as spells began soaring through the air from his back. At the same time, Ins cast the 9th tier spell, Vermilion Nova. The strongest single target, fire-based spell attack began to scorch Riku, yet his opponent showed no signs of slowing down as the great sword cleaved towards Ins again. Even though his body was bathed in fire, his swordsmanship remained calm and steady. If he had made his resolve as a warrior, this would not be too surprising, but the complete lack of response from him was suspicious to say the least. The elemental skull cast a 9th tier spell, Polar Claw. A claw that emitted air as chilled as the poles clawed at Riku. This was a spell that Ins had not learned. It had no secondary effects but dealt a lot of damage, the highest DPS of any ice-based spell in fact. Ins memorized the amount of damage Riku took from the 2 spells. This was while he was receiving a simultaneous strike from the spear and the katana. He cast another 9th tier spell, Call Greater Thunder. The elemental skull on the other hand, cast a 10th tier spell, Mist of Super Acid. This was also a spell that Ins had not learned, that was the reason why he had summoned the elemental skull. Riku was instantly surrounded by a mist of strong acid and so were his weapons. Mist of Super Acid not only damaged an opponent, but also their equipment and weapons, albeit only a small amount of damage to those. Surely the floating armaments around Riku counted as his equipment, right? Even the weapons around Riku were damaged yet Ins, who was well within the AoE, was unscathed. This was because of a special condition applied to the spell. Riku's HP loss from the acid was notable. Of the 4 elements, he took the most amount of damage from acid. That said, the actual percentage of HP loss was still low. Through the analysis of every bit of intel he had, Riku must have had defense-focused job classes. He was probably around level 90. In any case, the best strategy is to use acid Attica. It hurts so much. Nuisance. His anger flared up as his thoughts were interrupted, but then a miracle occurred. He managed to perfectly bat the katana flying towards him away with his staff, causing In's non-existent eyes to widen. The spear was blown away as if the knockback effect had activated. Why? This staff's knockback effect had all kinds of activation conditions placed upon it. First of all, blocking a warrior's strike with the staff would not trigger the effect. The effect would not trigger at all if the staff was not used offensively. If an opponent blocked the attacker's blow with a sword or shield, its effect would not trigger. It would only trigger if one were to land a blow on their opponent's body with it. A sword or shield would obviously not count as an opponent's body. That was why the effect would still trigger if one were to strike an opponent's gauntlet. So what happened to Riku's katana? Given the conditions mentioned, that meant that the floating weapons counted as a part of the wielder's body. But that wouldn't make sense. Sabas had brought back weapons from the capital in the past. Floating weapons used by a dancer. The weapons were analyzed in detail when they were sent to the treasury and judged to be simple floating weaponry that obeyed commands to attack in a semi-autonomous way. It should only count as equipment, which meant that if the staff were to strike the dancer's weapon, the knockback effect should not trigger. If the knockback were to be applied on equipment, only weapons like female sensei's Iron Fist of Wrath would be able to pull it off. That was a weapon that had the sole purpose of creating shockwaves when the wielder punched the air. As a weapon that applied knockback to everything, it could also apply knockback on equipment. But this staff was nowhere near as powerful as that weapon, so why was it able to do such a thing? From these series of tautologies, he deduced the answer: Riku's weapons counted as a part of his body. I see. Ins had two hypotheses around the mechanics behind this. First was that Riku's weapons were creatures like Entima's blade bugs. If he was like that sword Saint Golem, it would make sense why the knockback effect was triggered. The other hypothesis, the more likely one, was that the weapons were not equipment at all, but were actual parts of Riku's body. This would be a similar situation to how the knockback effect would still apply if the staff strike was to be met with a dragon's claw attack. He had felt that the weapons had HP too, but thought that it was because they counted as Riku's equipment. It was a mistaken assumption based on the fact that they took damage when Riku took damage. It appeared as though those were separate health bars, so that moment felt like forever to Ins in his infinite confusion. What if he used those methods? But would that be the correct decision? No, wrong, that would be a mistake. Ins felt the elemental skull cast the 10th tier divine spell, 7 Trumpeter, and immediately cancelled the cast. He had to reaffirm his role in all of this. Ins silently cast a message as Riku retreated as if he was chasing after the knocked back katana. The katana then returned to its original position. So if the weapons were to be separated from Riku by a certain distance, they could no longer move. Or was his opponent trying to make him think that? Or was he just shocked that it was knocked back? We more or less understand each other's powers. That's good, Inu. Riku slashed towards Ins as he glided along the ground. He did not intend to speak. Ins grumbled deep down at that fact. It made sense for his opponent to wish to make the most of his time. To answer one's opponent in battle would be a foolish action. So while he respected Riku's commitment to his strategy, he was still annoyed that his opponent was ignoring him. Wait. I haven't finished. Ins, in the midst of Riku's attacks, threw his staff behind himself. He could see that Riku was slightly confused. Ins kneeled down immediately. Wait. Please wait. Listen to me. The great sword in Riku's hand stopped on its way to Ins's head. Because he was immune to critical strikes, he wasn't too scared to lower his defenseless head. He gave an order to the elemental skull at the same time. I did not mean to clash with your excellency. This whole thing started because the kingdom stole the grain that was meant as food aid to the Holy Kingdom. Between them and us, the greater evil should be obvious. What does your excellency think? That we were the greater evil? You went too far. There had to be better ways to deal with that. Ins raised his head. Riku's greatsword remained suspended. It seemed like he had no intention to strike him at the moment. That is because your excellency was not the victim. How would your excellency have dealt with this? When the grain that your countrymen toiled to produce was stolen away. If you did not have the power that you have, things would not have turned out this way. People with power have to be careful about how they use their power and take responsibility for their actions. For example, protect the world. Indeed. This world is under my protection. Upon hearing his opponent's rhetoric, Ins thought, this dumbass is finally talking. He was being a silent listener. Some people preferred audience response during their speeches while others did not. From his self-righteous tone Ins could tell it was best that he kept quiet. Ins took mental notes of everything he said. The deeds of those who gathered around my loving mother were wrong. They were wrong in the same way that father was. In the end, absolute power corrupts absolutely. It is the source of all faults. Ins observed Riku in silence, calming his breath as much as he could. Riku was being impassioned. Ins should not be as rude to interrupt him. To be honest, Ins could not understand what Riku was talking about at all, but at the same time he did not sound like he was just rambling nonsense. He should have at least spoken in a way that a layman like Ins could understand. Although the root of every wrong could be traced back to us, I will not seek forgiveness for that, nor can I allow you to continue on your current path of destruction. That is why perish. Whoosh, the great sword swung down. Perhaps he felt guilty for executing the defenseless Ins. The sword was swung at a much slower speed than before. Hold up, please reveal some more intel while you're in a good mood, Ins almost said out loud. His opponent did not intend to speak anymore, so there was no need to keep up the act. The battle continued. The elemental skull, which he had commanded to be on standby, rushed into the greatsword's trajectory and took the hit. This was an effective use of a summon, because the elemental skull was no longer of use to him. That was why this was the right choice. If, say, this was against Ch4's Spirit Lance, he would not have done that. However, since Riku's weapon did not have lifesteal abilities, he could freely use summons as sacrifices. Hi. So this was all your fault. Are you not in the wrong then? Ins let out a pitiful cry. Who was them? What did they do wrong? Ins could not understand at all, but if he phrased his response this way, perhaps Riku would expose some more intel. It was worth a try. Perhaps he really was feeling guilty. His movements were much tardier than before. Ins capitalized on this opportunity to roll backwards. The elemental skull rushed in between them. Block him. The elemental skull cast its spell while Ins yelled. Riku ignored the skull and charged for Ins. The elemental skull attempted to stop him, but due to its size and a lack of skills to do so, it failed. Wall of skeleton. Ins cast his spell to erect a wall to keep both Riku and the elemental skull on the other side. How pathetic, Sorcerer King! Riku bellowed with anger. Perhaps his fury was because Ins had left his summon on the other side of the wall so he could escape, but it did not matter to Ins. If a magic caster was not behind someone but stood alone, it would be no different from suicide. It would be worse then. He could have easily flown over the wall, but Ins felt that Riku was attacking both the elemental skull and the wall. Compared to the elemental skull, the wall of skeleton wasn't too durable. It crumbled immediately at Riku's strike. The elemental skull had cast multiple Vermilion Novas to reduce Riku's HP, but to defeat him would be a tall order. It could be because of his job classes, but his magic resistance was abnormally high. Given that was the case, Ins cast a spell on Riku. Temporal Stasis. This was a 9th tier single target spell. Although the spell could prevent the opponent from moving, it also prevented them from taking any damage while the spell lasted. That was why it was usually used when there were multiple hostiles. However, Ins found that his spell was not just resisted, but nullified completely. It appeared that Riku had time-stop countermeasures. Of course, that wasn't too unusual given how strong he was. At the same time the great sword was swung towards Ins, the hammer was also swung towards the elemental skull. Ins tanked the great sword's damage and as a precaution, cast greater break item on the other weapons flying towards him. It was not just resisted, but nullified again. So it was true that the weapons counted as Riku's body. As the elemental skull took a massive amount of damage, Riku looked into the air in panic. A figure was rapidly descending. It was Albedo. Ins heard Riku let out a sound that couldn't even be defined as a sound. He was absolutely stunned. As Riku shook, Albedo approached him. Her speed was on par with one of Aura's arrows. And then, "You bastard, While that terrifying roar was heard, the halberd named 3F was swung down with the intention to split Riku's head open. Riku raised his great sword and spear in a cross to block her attack. The impact created by 3F was sizable, as both of Riku's feet were sunk into the ground. In the next moment, Riku was blown away to the side. Albedo had stomped her foot onto Riku's chest. The armor let out a pitiful clang. "You insect! How dare you disrespect Insama? Unforgivable!" Albedo's declaration caused the air around them to quake. She began attacking afterwards. The distance between the two was closed in an instant as Riku received an attack with enough force to send him into orbit. The sound of metal clashing together rang out at an ear-piercing volume. Riku used two of the floating weapons to block this attack. He flew backwards with all of his strength. Not with a jump, he flew back without his feet touching the ground. "Albedo, stop. That is enough." Ins halted Albedo, who was about to follow up on her attack. That was enough, he should not allow Albedo to fight any longer. Understood. While her glance told him that she was unhappy, Albedo still stopped moving. It was probably correct to assume that he no longer wished to fight. Riku began ascending to pull some distance between them. Albedo stood silently by In's side, using her own body as a shield against Riku. She was probably on alert for long-range attacks by the enemy. "Agnyadana. I will say it again. Become my subordinate. How about it? I will give you everything you have ever wanted for." His proposal received no reply, yet Ins continued on. "How unfortunate. Still, the Source Rouse Kingdom's doors are always open to you. You may come to visit any time you want." After he said that, Ins lowered his voice to say to Albedo, "Do you think he still wants to fight?" "No, I do not think he wants to anymore. But, if he is not retreating, it might be best for us to defeat him right here. If we both attacked at the same time, it should not be too difficult, right?" While he should not have heard their conversation, Riku disappeared nonetheless. The barrier he had erected also melted away. Ins was not sure if he had teleported before taking down the barrier or vice versa, nor could he tell where he ran off to. Although there were still things that had to be investigated, Ins felt as though they had successfully completed their mission. "Good grief, that takes care of that. Good work. I am not worthy of such praise. There still might be people surveilling us. It is best for us to return to Nazarick first." "Ah, let us do that then." After recalling the elemental skull, Ins cast greater teleportation to retreat with Albedo. The armored man who went by the name of Riku Agnaya used world teleportation to get to their predetermined meeting spot. He showed up in front of his collaborator, who had already been waiting for him there. "Sorry I'm late." "Nah, don't sweat it. I just arrived too." The respondent was none other than the leader of the Adamantite-ranked adventurer group Red Drop, Ajuth. Because he was wearing his familiar powered suit, Riku had to look upwards when speaking to him. He wasn't being honest, however. Ajuth had been waiting there for 5 minutes already. And as to the reason why Riku knew this, he had been observing this place from afar for a while now. The reason for which should be obvious: he was worried that Azoth was serving as bait. If the Sorcerer King's subordinates were indeed surveilling Azoth, Riku would abandon him immediately to return to his own country. That was why before he had even started checking if they were being watched, he had been keeping an eye out for his surroundings. That said, therein laid a different kind of danger, one that would require conversing with Azoth to confirm. Which was why Riku had appeared before Azoth. "Sorry, TSA. She got away. I think she was headed towards where you were. Did you finish the Sorcerer King off?" "Unfortunately, no. Even though you lent me your power, I truly am sorry." The one who had called himself Riku Agnaya in front of the Sorcerer King, Ch4 Vision, lowered his head. Perhaps the other Dragon Lords would say that this was beneath the dignity expected of a long-lived Dragon Lord, one who stood at the top of the world, but TSA did not care much for that. If him bowing allowed him to curry favor with another party, he would bow any number of times. "There's no need to apologize. It was my fault that that woman was not delayed for longer. You couldn't defeat him because you didn't have enough time, right?" TSA thought long and hard about what kind of response would paint him in the best light and ended up just gently saying to Azoth, "Not at all. No, Azoth. While it was unfortunate that the Prime Minister of the Sorcerer's Kingdom, Albedo, wasn't someone that you could handle, you were still able to hold her up for such a long time. That was honestly a great help. I couldn't vanquish the Sorcerer King simply because he was much stronger than I had anticipated." In truth, that was indeed the case. During their previous meetings, Azoth had been assigned the mission to draw Albedo away from the barrier. If he was being honest, he thought that it wouldn't be too surprising if Azoth was slain by Albedo, but had he said this out loud, it was easy for him to imagine that Azoth would no longer offer his help. For that reason, he had not explained the full details of the plan to him. Given the above, it was truly impressive how Azoth managed to survive a scuffle with Albedo. To TSA, his most important duty was to stay vigilant of players who held malicious intent towards this world, which was why he did not want to just blindly expend his strength. Still, he had a question in mind, or rather something he couldn't figure out. That was of course, why Azoth had survived. The powered suit he wore could indeed raise the wearer's offensive and defensive capabilities while also providing the user with a variety of abilities. It did not, however, raise the wearer's HP or MP at all. It was like a sturdy chitin exoskeleton covering an insect's soft innards. While his combat interactions with Albedo were short, he still understood one thing: she was much stronger than the Sorcerer King. That was probably because the Sorcerer King was more adept at handling large armies, so he might not have been able to fight at his full potential in a one-on-one. In any case, Azoth was definitely not strong enough to survive a fight with Albedo with any ease. So, how exactly did Azoth survive? That demon, Albedo, is there any way we could take her out? No, it's near impossible. I had to use the full arsenal of the suit and created as much distance between us as possible to barely even hang on to dear life. So that was how it was. Indeed, Albedo did not use any ranged attacks, nor did she appear to have any ranged weapons. Everything made sense then. His previous speculations seemed a bit malicious in hindsight. TSA felt ashamed for his own thoughts. He had suspected that Azoth had made a deal with Albedo, or perhaps with the Sorcerer King himself, to betray him. With that said, all was fair play in terms of hypotheticals. At the end of the day, Azoth was just a collaborator and not a companion. Moreover, he had no concrete evidence to support the notion that Azoth had not betrayed him. Ah, right. I told the Sorcerer King that my name was Riku Agnaya, do keep a note of that. If the Sorcerer King were to ask, tell him that it was a fake name. Riku Agnaya, does that name signify anything? None at all, just a random name I came up with. But, if someone in the world did have that name, it would probably cause them a lot of trouble. That was only a half-truth. Indeed, he had not heard of Agnya being used as a surname before, but the name Riku was a real one. It would rouse the Sorcerer King's anger towards them, which wouldn't be a minor issue. Indeed. Don't forget about the anger of the Prime Minister of the Sorcerer's Kingdom, Albedo too. The two laughed softly. Of course, if someone named Riku Agnya really existed in this world, this wouldn't be something to scoff at, for that guy at least. Tsa laughed as he recalled. The demon named Albedo. The Sorcerer King was not able to break through the barrier, so he wasn't that much of a threat. That demon, however, was able to pass through the wild magic spell, world isolating barrier. This mid-tier wild magic spell could create a space that was separate from reality. It prevented entry through all conventional means as well as any attempts to teleport out of it. To be able to enter the barrier meant that Albedo was either a wild magic user, or possessed a world item. While he had not confirmed if that demon was a player or NPC, from the master-servant relation between the two, it was most likely the latter. But if that was the case, why would Ins not equip the world item himself, but give it to Albedo instead? That was a mystery. Unless Albedo is the player and the Sorcerer King is the NPC. This wouldn't be too ridiculous of an idea. To rank second in this world's hierarchy was probably a safer choice. Perhaps the Sorcerer King had a world item too? But since he couldn't break out of the barrier, the likelihood would be low, right? Or maybe he left his world item behind. That was certainly possible. He had heard from Riku that there were guilds that possessed two WCIs, so it was possible that they had two too. Tsa, how strong was the Sorcerer King? If he was someone that not even you could defeat, I feel like he would be really strong. If it were me, no, if it were this, could it win? Ajuth, no offense, but no. He's an opponent that not even I could defeat easily. Is that so? But thanks to your assistance, I have a general idea of his baseline capabilities now. Of course, if I were to face the Sorcerer King one-on-one again, I should be able to triumph. He had said that much, but if he relied on this armor, victory would be hard fought. Perhaps he should make preparations on where they would fight. But, Ch4 sighed. If he was of a similar level to the vampire from last time, this armor would probably struggle in serious combat. However, if he were to not use the armor but face the Sorcerer King in person, he could not lose. That would be true even if he was as strong as the vampire. As long as he fought using his real body, there would be no issues at all. Still, if he gave them too much time to expand their influence, things would get out of hand. As expected of you, the strongest dragon lord in the world. I don't think so myself. There are many out there who are stronger than I am. I can win against the Sorcerer King because I happen to counter him. Tsa's abilities were more effective against the undead. He had also confirmed in the battle just then that his abilities did work on the Sorcerer King. That was why Tsa had judged the Sorcerer King to be an opponent that did not warrant too much caution. Compared to the Sorcerer King, the demon named Albedo was much more dangerous. Pardon me, Ajuth, should another situation like this arise, would you still be willing to assist me? Next time? Ajuth solemnly muttered a single phrase. Tsa understood the meaning behind his words, and did not question him any further. After some time had passed, Ajuth finally spoke. Will the kingdom perish? It probably will. There is not much I could do to help even if I want to. Is that so? So next time I'll also have to buy time with that Demonis? I could, but you do know that there's a chance that I won't be able to buy any time at all the next time around, right? Indeed, they might not split up next time. That is why, if that Demonis left the Sorcerer King's side for any reason at all, would you be willing to fight the Sorcerer King alongside me? If Ajuth handled the summons, Tsa could definitely defeat the Sorcerer King. He had not been assaulted by the Sorcerer King's subordinates during their little conversation here. There was nothing left for him to do here. Tsa shifted his gaze towards the capital far, far away. Tsa had already witnessed the fall of many nations. This one will soon be facing its own destruction. Tsa felt somewhat lonesome, but compared to that, he was more anxious of the fact that these lands will soon fall under the Sorcerer's kingdom's rule. Although he had not received any grace from this kingdom, he will still miss it dearly. While he had already notified his companions, perhaps there was also a need to call upon the other dragon lords too. Almost forgot, I met with the people from the theocracy and mentioned the name you told me. Really? Now they'll know that you have someone backing you up. If that was the case, Azutha's safety was more or less guaranteed. Azuth himself held no value at all, but the powered suit in his possession was an item of great importance, important enough that the theocracy might plot against him for it. For that reason, he had to make them think that Azuth had protection to fall back on so that they wouldn't make any moves against him. This also strengthened the relationship he had with Azuth. It was a move that had nothing but upsides. I have a question, why not tell them that I heard it from you directly? Simple, if they had no clue on where the information source was, they would try to investigate it. There is a chance that it could cause some friction among the upper echelons of the theocracy. Other than that, there was another reason. Should an emergency arise, he could kill off Azuth without leaving any loose ends. This is no place to talk, let's go back. Your companions must be waiting for you, right? Yes, they're waiting for me. I'll leave it to you then, Tsa. Just as Tsa was about to cast world teleportation, he thought about Azuth. It was only for a single reason, the question of whether it was still beneficial to assist him or not. Sure, Azuth's powered suit was highly valuable, but without it he was nothing. To put it bluntly, if the powered suit were in more capable hands, they would surely be able to utilize it to its full potential. Plus, Tsa had no confidence that he could rein him in. Azuth as he stood, was more of an aide to Tsa than a companion. If he were to go off script like last time, it would most likely lead to catastrophic losses. Indeed, Tsa was in the wrong that time too. To give unto Azuth the appropriate level of alertness against the Sorcerer King's invasion, he had discussed the likely outcomes of the invasion with him in detail. Azuth had requested Tsa's aid in defeating the Sorcerer King to save the kingdom. He should have predicted back then that he would use the powered suit to rescue that city. If he had not taken independent action back then, surely Tsa would have been able to defeat the Sorcerer King during his siege of the capital. Should he just kill Azuth and take the powered suit? This wasn't too bad of an idea to Tsa. If he gave the powered suit to someone who was powerful enough to bend it to their will, it would definitely be more useful than letting Azuth keep it. He could also gain a stronger card for his hand then. Personally, Tsa felt no disdain for Azuth, nor did he want to kill him himself, but of what worth were emotions in this world? Riku. What was I reminiscing for now that things have turned out that way? Tsa laughed at himself internally. These two hands of his were already besmirched with filth. It was better to do it now than later. Plus, he could blame it on the Sorcerer King if he did it now. Azuth fought until he lost consciousness with Albedo and later handed the powered suit to Tsa. That would be a good cover story. But should he really allow history to repeat itself again? Oi, what's wrong, Tsa? Huh. Tsa finally noticed that he had been deep in his own thoughts. What's wrong? Did you notice something suspicious? Nothing. Azuth, let's go back. He should put those thoughts aside. Resurrection magic was a thing, death could not guarantee one's silence. If he returned with just the powered suit but not Azuth's body, it would rouse suspicion. If one were to act purely on utilitarian principles, it would lead to negative consequences more often than not. Just so he would have no regrets, it was best for him to return and give it greater consideration before making his judgment on whether or not he should give up on Red Drop. TSA prayed that his actions on this day would not lead to fatal errors in the future as he cast world teleportation. The night winds blew through unoccupied space.